All right, let's bring everybody in. Let's bring in Mr. Tom Morris, Mr. Bob Farnham, Mr. Chip Griffin. Welcome, 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 guys. And a very important guest, Tamsen Webster. I was, as always, Tom. Let me put you out your misery and just have you start soon, because when Tamsen starts talking about dead philosophers, you're probably jumping up and down, and so just take it away.
I'm still alive. Hey, Tamsen, I took notes and I've got a red thread going down the page of my notes on your episode, even though I was getting my flu shot, so I had to miss the first half hour of the show. But this
good for you.
This is just the 25 minutes that I heard. So thank you for being a part of this today. It's just
my gosh, I'm happy to. I'm so thankful for Joe.
So much of what you said connects with a philosopher like me, and I know Ryan. I love his books. He does a really good job with it. The moral imagination is behind so much of what you were saying today. The moral imagination, getting into your customer's skin, getting into your neighbor's skin, morally imagining. That's why I've always thought the golden rule is stated the way it is. Treat others the way you would want to be treated if you were in their circumstances. And people raise various objections against that, which are easily answered. But one thing it makes you do, it makes you imagine what your legitimate wants and needs would be if you were in your neighbor's circumstances or your customer's circumstances. It draws on what I think is the single strongest human power, the power of the imagination. And so much of what you were saying today about being useful and thoughtful and passionate and kind, and what you were saying about radical empathy, so much of that draws on the deep well of the moral imagination, which too many people in the corporate world ignore altogether. So, thanks for what you're doing and for the way you're bringing it to the rest of us with such vibrancy. As you live your own advice, it multiplies its power.
There's power in consonance in all of the different meanings of that, both, physical and sound and psychological, right? Consonance, because it's such a functional, we can't help it. Like we, as I said on the show, like we will not do something long-term externally that does not align internally with all that wiring. And so just having that understanding and applying that same, standard to ourselves, because I think a lot of times we're like, yeah, totally. I'm never, inconsistent. We're completely inconsistent all the time. But we try not to be, and that's the important thing, and understand that that's where other people are coming from. I think that's key. I often call it the persuader's paradox, right? Where a lot of times what we end up doing to try to persuade other people are things that we know 100% that if it were done to us, we'd be like, what the heck are you doing? Like, that's not going to work. And yet somehow we feel like, well, if I'm doing it, it's going to be magically effective. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. Like, people are people, in the wise words of Depeche Mode.
And often we rather than using the golden rule ourselves, we sort of push the other people to imagine our perspective and what we want and what we need. We're asking of them rather than giving to them, rather than taking the initiative. And what you said today was so good about the polarization stuff, and about sort of be willing to give a little bit before you expect to get a little bit, because those deep reciprocity genes are more likely than not to respond. And if they don't, I have a friend who's a famous CEO of a big company, and he says, you can't make a good deal with a bad person. No matter how good the deal looks, it'll go bad. So if the other person doesn't have or show any reciprocity, then walk away from it, because it's not for you.
Yeah, I have this wonderful service that someone pointed me to probably about a year or so ago now, called readwise.io. And I can pop it in the chat when I'm not talking, because talking and typing at the same time is hard for me. But what it will do is it'll take your highlights from Pocket and from your Kindle or your iPad or whatever, and it will synthesize them and then send 5 of them back to you every day in an email.
Wow.
Oh my gosh, I love it. So basically, it just kind of reminds me of these things that I found interesting over the last now like 5 to 7 years of reading books electronically. And one of them just reminded me of what you said, Tom, because it was talking about how long-term, the best indicator of how someone's going to treat you is actually their principles. And that somebody who is, whose principles align with yours, you're much more likely to have a better long-term relationship than somebody who is engaging, charismatic, or whatever. And yet in the short term, it's a lot easier. It's hard to recognize principles quickly. Yeah. Like that is something that you have to see over time. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of those things where it's like, I know a huge component of what I do is very much focused on that long view, because as Shakespeare would say, the truth will out over time. And that's where a lot of companies fall down with their brand. But that's where a lot of people fall down too, is again, we do not operate long-term in ways that are inconsistent with our deeper beliefs. But anyway,
see, that's so cool, Tamara, because a lot of people try to replace character with personality, and a lot of that goes on in branding too, right? Yeah. The company wants you to see their personality, but it's their character that's really hidden away. And it's the character that's all the principles and the values, which are always commitments. Principles and values are just commitments, and commitments are just deep-seated tendencies to act in one way rather than another, right? And so people can often hide their character behind their flashy personality. And that's why trust is so easily lost. When we finally see through all the fireworks of personality and we catch a glimpse of character and it's not what we want to see, whoa, we back off. Yeah. And the brand has lost us, or the person has lost us. That's cool stuff. It's fun to philosophize with you in the afternoon.
It is fun. Yeah, thanks. Okay, sorry. We should probably stop just to have some conversation with other folks.
I should let everybody else have a chance. Yeah. So thank you, Joseph. I promise to shut up now for at least a bit.
Right. Well, and just to make sure that you come good on your promise, I'm going to mute you. And I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
But you took notes, Tom. So you have a right to speak if you take notes.
I took notes. I appreciate it. Chip just
Chip goes. I basically said to Chip, good to have you back. And he said, I sent him a private message. He said, didn't want to lose my membership in the club. So I thought I would try to appear. You're lucky because you almost did lose your status.
Just that close. You were
and for every time you show up, you're entitled to 3 snarky comments, Chip. So I think you had 4 today.
I'm already past that. So.
Oh, okay. I was like, 3 now? Like I'm ready for number 1. Like what's
but I think Tamsen, going back to this idea of the way you framed it, right? Persuasion versus polarization. A lot of this comes down to when we think, you sent the article, right, with respect to, that talks about anti-vaxxers. You're never going to change someone's worldview. We're learning that. We've learned that. I think we should have learned that. It's hard for us to learn it because we keep on thinking we can, until you actually empathize and attempt to walk, that proverbial mile in their moccasins. But you said something today, and I was thinking, Mr. Bob Farnham over here, he was probably thinking the same thing that I was when you said the other side, this other side, they're smart and they're, educated and in touch. And Bob was probably thinking, I don't know if they are, but that's the trap, right? And I think I think your point is a very powerful one. Which is instead of labeling, instead of judging, instead of stereotyping, which of course marketers love to do, find the truth, find the point of connection, find, the reciprocity. That's the only way we're going to figure out a middle ground.
You have to, what I've just found to be much more successful is to stop and say, well, why would they think that that's the right answer? Why would they? If I were in that situation, why would I? Or what is it? What could possibly be in their situation that would make them feel like this is the right answer for them? Again, whatever side, because I see equal issues on both sides with this. Like this is not on one side or the other. Like both sides are doing this to the other on all sorts of issues right now, because it's just the first thing is like, you're crazy. That's nuts. How could you ever? You must be out of touch. What are you doing? Like these, but to kind of step back. I mean, there's no better cure for this to have somebody in your own family that has some of these perspectives, because that actually forces you to try to resolve that cognitive dissonance of, here's a person that I know to be principled, good person. And yet they hold these ideas that I'm just like, what? How?
It's amazing, isn't it? The most outrageous point of view. If you scratch it a little bit, you come up with a genuine human concern, something that you can relate to even beyond the outrageousness. And you say, oh, that's where this is coming from. Right?
And it gets complicated though, too. I mean, if you spend any time studying this, and I'm sure, some of you probably have, it's just that, then we get to this point of a problem of an entrenchment. Right. And what happens is that then becomes a point of identity of having had this position. And that once that's become an identity piece, it becomes really hard for that person to release it. Because again, we want to be seen as smart, capable, and good. So to have admitted that perhaps we may have been wrong is actually one of the hardest things for a human to do.
By the way, just to mention quickly, and then I'll see if anyone else wants to jump in that article that you sent, that the link that you sent, Tamsen, it cites a guy by the name of Seth Mnookin, who wrote a book called The Panic Virus. And the subtext there is the true story behind the vaccine autism controversy. And it's the most, I actually reached out to him to see if he'll come on the show, but I think he's a little, he's probably sought after by all the networks at the moment. But it's a very interesting story that a man with very selfish, questionable, and less than honest motives almost created this untrue allegation that was not based on facts, that was not medically backed up, and it just took off and caused so much damage along the way. But this book itself has actually helped bring some of these anti-vaxxers around. So it's been interesting development. That's what happened when I went down
that hole.
I went down a rabbit hole, but I had a red thread to help me back up again.
So Bob, did you have a comment?
Well, I was just curious how do we deal with the cognitive dissonance in that I think that's how you pronounce it, right? Because I run into it a lot in politics every day. I ran into it today with the governor of Vermont, who overrode a bill that was then voted on by the House, where 103 to 47 passed it. And then it went to the Senate, where 22 people passed it out of 30. So it was a big override. And the poll that came out today from Vermont Public Television and Public Radio showed the governor having like a 65% positive rating in the state. And yet he's completely out of touch with the electorate. And I don't know how to have people realize that, they have bought themselves into a position that they can't get out of. They're known as supporters of Phil Scott, and that's all fine and good, but he's not really representing your best interests.
I think we've all
with our president,
Yeah, let me be clear that I'm not an expert in the psychology of cognitive dissonance. I've done a lot of reading on it and research on it, just because it is so critical to getting people to understand ideas. Like basically you have to understand the world into which you're putting them out there. Right. And what the literature says is that, and I think we've all had this experience is, there is a point at which either, facts alone don't switch people. They don't sway people, right? Unless they're personal facts. And I don't mean alternative facts. I mean, the situation changes when it changes for you.
Right. Yeah. And when your mother has COVID and dies.
Right. When that kind of thing happens, then you change. And of course we don't want that to happen to people. And so the challenge is, how do you start to create those kinds of levels of awareness for people without that. And again, another thing that resurfaced to me via Readwise the other day was, a study that was done about, presenting people with, surprising facts, trying to get them to move their position versus two stories, of individual stories that they could, they told people that, again, communicated the same surprising statistics. It was just in the context of story. And I'm not going to get this quote 100% right, I'm sure, but they said, really the conclusion of the study, what was stunning to them was the level of unwillingness for people to draw the particular from the general, right? So general statistic, what does that actually mean to me? The people's level of unwillingness to do that is exceeded only by their willingness to extend the particular to the general. Mm-hmm. So two stories of individual people were much more likely to take people's perspectives and change it than all of the data and all of the facts and whatever. And so I think there's hints at things like that, where people need to start to hear stories about the dissonance and stories about how people resolved that. Because once they start to say, oh, look, that person's like me, they're experiencing, and you can evoke a kind of dissonance that they can identify with, and then they can see how that person resolved it, ideally in a way that feels consistent with that, with the kind of original listener, and going, that's consistent with how I see the world too. Then you start opening people up to a path of how they can moderate off of their position in a way that feels safe, because then they're not the only ones. You've shown them a path that doesn't challenge their wants and beliefs, that it upholds their worldview. And that's really the key. But, so everything we were talking about on the show, you can't do that without understanding the worldview to start with.
There's one more thing that I would just add in terms of, using this metaphor, which is and it works nicely with the Minotaur again. I'm not going back to the bull part, but although I just did, but it's people are unable to reverse their position or back away or back off from that position. And that's the problem, is they've become so entrenched that they don't actually feel that there is any solace there. It is unforgiving and unrelenting to be able to reverse their position. So I was thinking maybe the answer then, and this is, positioning wise, is not to reverse your position, but to find a new path, a new path.
Yes. I mean, that's the mechanism at play in the red thread method that I've developed, is to open a new path to people within the worldview that they already have. Open a path, and that's the process that I lead companies through, is how do we do that? How do we create a message that opens a new path that isn't threatening and therefore doesn't trigger all of that? How do we do this? That said, there actually is, there is one way that so far looks like it works as far as getting people to moderate off of an entrenched position, not just stories, but it's something called, it's paradoxical thinking is actually what it's doing. What you do is you get someone to go logically beyond the point where they are. Right. So you get them you have a conversation with them where you're starting to establish, okay, if we were to take your position and take it to its logical extreme, again, you can't do this from a judgmental position. You have to do it from a curiosity driven one. That once they kind of take their position to the illogical extreme, they will then moderate their own position on it. And that was work that was originally done actually with folks on either side of the Israeli-Palestinian a disagreement is completely understating it, but you know what I'm saying, on either side of that, that they find that works. And that's been subsequently also supported in conversations with approaching folks about climate change. That if you can get people to agree, for instance, it's a variation on that, but if you can get people who basically say climate change has no roots in human thing, there's no scientific base, there's not possible. There was, some studies that were done that basically showed if you can get people to agree that science does explain some things, then they actually start to moderate off of that a little bit. basically you can get, if you can get them to agree, for instance, that gravity exists and gravity explains why things stay on the ground. If you can get them to agree with that, and if you can get them to agree that germs and bacteria are the cause of disease, for instance, that's a thing that science has shown has had a deliberate cause and effect, then it becomes harder for them to deny a scientific answer for something else. And so that's to me, a way to start to think about this idea of opening alternate paths is just, how else can you do that? So, a thing, for instance, that I found useful. So I'll be clear here that like, I'm definitely in the mask wearing camp. But one of the approaches that I have found to be somewhat successful in getting people to moderate their position is stay away from where the entrenchment is based right now. Stay away from the identity, away from the politics, completely off of that. And what has been effective, for instance, is to say, a little bit of data. So for instance, the data point that I've been using that seems to be effective is, right now where it stands. So Joe, to where you started today with 200,000, COVID-19 is the third leading cause of death in America this year.
So far,
behind cancer and heart disease. And ahead of accidents. Let that process in your mind right now, that you are more likely to die this year of COVID. What everybody says, death rates, hospitalizations, whatever, you are more likely to die of COVID-19 than through a car accident. And you're only more likely to die from cancer and heart disease than from that. So, and any people say, well, I'm not going to die of cancer or heart disease this year. Great. Do you do things in your life that you do to prevent your future death from cancer and heart disease? Do you try to eat well? Do you try to move? Do you try to make sure that you're not feeding carcinogenic things to your kids? Are you making sure, for instance, that you're taking those? Are you even doing things to prevent accidents or death by accident in your house? Do you have a smoke detector? Do you wear your seatbelt? Whatever. Are you doing those things? So if you are taking those actions around the things that surround COVID-19 that are preventative, in that sense, help me understand your role on masks in context of that. Because if you're willing to be preventive in the causes of death on either side, how can you be consistent with that and also not do something that's preventive to this piece, when inarguable fact is that it is the third leading cause of death? Maybe it won't be for you, and yes, the infection rate is low, death rate is low, not arguing with that. I completely agree with you on all of that. And yet it's the third leading cause of death. So how does that work? So that's the kind, it's that kind of thinking that, I wouldn't necessarily present it that way, because that can start to, even just my stating is like, but you start to see how someone goes, that's okay. That's kind of hard to, all right, that's true. Well, how could I, like, if I do that, if I wear my seatbelt, why wouldn't I wear a mask? If I take my blood pressure medication, why wouldn't, what's different?
But it's also so funny how, you spoke about what was it? The specific versus the general.
Yeah.
And, the reality is, look, 200,000, that is just a massive number. But for most people, they can't relate to it. They don't understand it. They become numb to it. Most people are becoming numb to it. The news has been talking about how cities about the size of 200,000 people would be all dead. They're trying. I can see it happening in the news. Where
that's a way to make it concrete.
That is a way to do it.
Specific, right?
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing. There was, and this was a few weeks ago, not that long ago, but it was it was on 9/11, obviously, that the number of deaths at the time, I think, was 195,000, was the equivalent of 64.3 consecutive back-to-back 9/11s. Yeah. 64 days for over 2 months. A 9/11 every single day. But even that, but did that cause, how many people did that cause to change their minds? And this was my own struggle, someone who was in New York City at the time. We continue to, as a country, as a people, to mourn and to mobilize and to have, all of these memorials, as we probably should, not probably, as we should for 9/11, because of the tragedy that it was and always will be. And yet we're living amidst one that is happening, 64 days consecutively and growing.
Yeah.
And we can't make that connection.
Well, that's the thing. We also have to remember that it is specific. And so this is, one of the things that I counsel my clients on is that, there is no such thing as one message to rule them all. Like you're going to, your hope is to get one that captures a fair amount, but it's like, for some people that may have been, hearing that stat in comparison with 9/11 may have been enough, right, to start to flip. For other folks, it's going to be the exposure to somebody in their family or whatever that is enough, right? Or it's somehow there's been this subtle, really what happens is that when someone's able to soften off of an entrenched position, it's because somehow either the conditions have existed, right? So I heard someone say just earlier this week, I love this, that you can't change people's minds. Only they can do that. Only someone can change their own mind, right? Like, and the way I like to say it is, you can't make people change. You can only create the conditions for it. And when it happens, it's because what you've been able to do is create the conditions where someone's able to anchor their belief on a stronger identity than the one it was anchored on before. And so if you're looking, Joe is trying to explain, again, I go back to like, well, why would that stat about 9/11 not sway somebody? Okay, well, that's because that stat is, right now you've got two equally strong identity things anchoring against each other, right? Which is 9/11 was an attack on America, and the people who are taking kind of an anti-COVID, anti-mask stance consider the mandatory shutdowns and the masks to be an attack on America. They consider it to be an attack on American values. So you haven't actually created a tension there. You've got, right now they're seen as just like, well, it's the same thing. And so it's just, that's where it comes into it. So I try in those moments is, and it's a practice. This is not always the first response. Let me just be clear. It's a practice. My first response is like all humans, like, are you insane? Like, what is wrong with you? And then the second one is like, okay, I'm going to assume there's nothing wrong with you. Why do you think this? Why doesn't that work? Why not? Because if I can understand more clearly why something isn't working, I've got a much better ground for understanding what will work in the future.
Tamsen, thank you very much for all. This has been great to sit and listen.
You're welcome.
Have you ever read the book, Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics? It's by
but that sounds
really. Yeah.
Jonathan Haidt.
It's called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics. And it's a very professorial approach to understanding everything you guys are talking about. It helped me understand politics, specifically because I grew up in Minnesota and I spent a lot of my early years up in Northern California, where a lot of my friends and relatives are Trumpers and conservatives just for many decades. And so for me, it was great because it really talks about understanding the person you're talking with first. It's not a matter of just ripping on them for being a bigot, because there are a lot of good people that vote for Donald Trump, as an example. And he wrote this book well before Mr. Trump was in the White House, but it was really good to understand. He talked specifically, the story that I remember most was one of his friends was Hindu, and he took him back to India, and he believed in the caste system and he believed in reincarnation. And so the servants that were serving them and the way they were treated and some of the people in the street, he said, how do you not hurt for these people? And he believed in his heart from birth that this is a caste system. This is how people are rewarded based on their behaviors in past lives. And it was one of those things where it gets into the indoctrination of both, the social constructs as well as a ideology, in this case, Hinduism. And it was a fascinating approach because they became really close. Understanding this is how you see the world. I don't think you're a bigot or lacking in compassion or that you're a bad person. I get it now, and it was, and that book is not only part of it. He also has a .org that studies human behavior as it relates to this. And he does a really wonderful job of explaining that if you're on an elephant, that's the emotion. And if someone says something that triggers you, you know, if you're left like I am, you swing to the left. And then the rider is the post hoc argument of logic and reason. And it's basically kind of irrelevant. So it's like after someone says something like mega, you know, and then we all like, oh, how can you possibly, you know? And so you no matter what they say anymore, you've heard mega and now you're emotionally triggered and you really don't have much logic and reason based on that. So it's a fantastic book. I just thought I'd mention that.
Thanks. No, that's exactly the kind of thing that I love hearing about, because it's, like I said, this is not for me, this is all stuff that's useful. Like I have, you know, made a choice to stay out of, people are like, why don't you help politicians? And I'm like, nope, this is not where my heart is.
A lot of people forget belief systems are, in principles, from our ancient past, belief systems are survival devices.
Right.
And this is true in a company, in a corporation. They can have certain belief systems that are their survival devices that may or may not be true, and they may or may not be working anymore. Right. But they cling onto these things as you would onto a life raft in a turbulent sea, because they view their system as necessary to their survival, right? And so that's why these things are so hard to dislodge with people. You know, Aristotle wrote the quintessential and classic book about persuasion, his Rhetoric, where he says there are three things you need to be persuasive: logos, pathos, and ethos. And the logos
and Kronos, actually, there's four.
You got the other one too. But the logos is information, rationality. The pathos is passion. Ethos is really crucial, the character. But I was thinking when y'all were talking a minute ago that why real estate brokers stage houses to sell is because not a lot of people have very good imaginations about what rooms could look like with great furniture and a great wall coloring and all that. Well, the moral imagination is very much like that. Not a lot of people are really practiced in using their moral imaginations. So, Tamsen, what you were talking about earlier, it's almost like if you tell the right stories, if you ask the right questions, you're doing the equivalent, the moral equivalent of staging a house to sell, right?
That's right.
And it's up to the buyer for them to buy it. You can't force the house on them, right?
Yeah.
They've got to make the decision to buy it, but you can stage it. You can make it look its best, you know, you can make the alternatives look like what they are, you know, and then you give that person's imagination a jump start, basically.
The way I describe, like, you know, one of the ways that I describe what I do with companies is like, or, you know, when I'm working with someone to figure out how to articulate their idea. So a lot of times that's, you know, that's academics, that's, you know, authors, you know, a lot of founders as well. I say what we're building is a story the audience will tell themselves about your idea.
Yeah.
So you're building an aspirational narrative, but it's one that they can act, that there's no dissonance when they tell them. That's why it has to be anchored in what they already want and what they already believe. It's why you have to validate what their current actions are, even if you disagree with them. Yeah. You have to say, you know, it makes sense that you would do this. It makes sense that you would believe this based on where you're coming from right now. And since I also know you believe this to be true, all right, now like that might, if you can put that into play, that starts to put what you want in jeopardy. Well, that's when you open that, you know, back to Joe, your point, like that allows folks to have a new path. They can start to see a new path that still feels like theirs. And that's a real key.
I have to say, I mean, this, you know, even though Bob has said, damn it, Joseph, 30 minutes is the after show. I'm giving you an extra 3 minutes. Because this conversation is beyond fascinating. Tamsen, you are beyond fascinating. Tom, that point about staging is absolutely, it's a brilliant point to use the idea of a house because of the idea of lacking imagination. I was thinking I want to make two quick points. One is when you look at the RNC and the DNC, right? These virtual conventions. They both were staging, but it was pretty obvious staging. It was like going into the default colonial home in New England with all the same fixtures and fittings. There was no, in that case, purple cow at all. There was no meat or bull in the fridge. There was a lot of bull, but no meat in the fridge. But it's interesting. There was no contrast. There was no ability to. It was all about reinforcing. So that was one point. The other thing is, I'm starting to think about, look, at this point, it's way too late for anyone to affect or impact any kind of influence or change, I think. But for me, the golden question now is this question of unity. And you have two forces, right? One is an impending civil war, which I think could happen. I really do. But the other one is, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to mend this? How are we going to come together again? You know, even thinking about what's about to happen with the Supreme Court, I'm thinking to myself, so now what's happening is the Democrats are like, wait until you see what, you know what it is? It's basically like, it just hit me. It's like an episode of Tom and Jerry. It's Tom and Jerry, or Spy versus Spy. And it never ends, and each one comes back stronger and more vindictive and more powerfully, and it just perpetuates, except for the fact that this isn't Mad Magazine, right? And this isn't, and this isn't a cartoon. This is real life. Well, but my point is, how do we mend? How do we fix? How do we come together? And so that is like the question that I've been thinking about, that I want to start asking, especially based on your insights today, Tamsen, which is to say, I'm not going to change your point of view. You're not going to change mine. I got a question for you. How do we heal? Like, what do you think is, like, it's to your point, the idea of paradoxical thinking. So how do you think this plays out? Why don't you take me down this path? Yeah. I'll even give you a red thread so you can come back. But why don't you tell me what happens next? What do you think the Democrats do next? And then what happens? And then what happens? And then what happens? And is this bringing us closer or further away from where I feel like you and I as Americans would want to be?
Because I think that's a powerful line of questioning. I mean, because it sounds like you can't undo what's been done. You can't, right? All we can do is like look forward from here. And so, frankly, it's a thing I want to experiment with next time somebody who holds one of these super strong positions like comes up in my feeds or wherever. Like, I really want to just say, like, okay, I get it. I get that you don't agree. I get that you don't agree. Like, I get that you think that we're overreacting. I get that you think that that all of this. What do you want us to do now? And I'm not saying not with any kind of attitude. Like, what are you suggesting? Because I hear you taking down what's wrong. But what's going to, I wrote a blog post a while back called like, why you have to give somebody a positive want. And this is a lesson I learned back at like Weight Watchers. Like, you can't just tell someone to stop doing something. That doesn't tell you what to do instead.
Yeah, you need to displace or replace.
You have to displace it, right? Yeah. And so to get people to kind of focus on, so what do you want to have happen? Okay, what needs to happen to get there? In certain cases, that's where some of that paradoxical thinking can come in, because it's like, so all of a sudden you realize, someone can come to their own conclusion that a path of thinking is only going to lead to further division. Just Joseph, as you've just said, like, you can stop and think to yourself, like, if I keep doing this, I feel like crap because I'm in this continual cycle of outrage, and I don't even know what we're gonna do. So like, let's try to do that because I don't know what else to do. So I think that's, I'm really curious about that as a way to do. It's just kind of like, could we just not even okay, what's next? Like, wherever we are right now, where do we go next? And when it comes to politicians, I had this really fascinating conversation with a woman who, for right now, actually wants to run against Boston's mayor, who generally has been acknowledged to do a pretty good job. And she is also well regarded. But I talked to her back when she was, just fairly new as a counselor at large in our city government. And she had such an interesting insight. She said, the skills that you need to get elected are fundamentally different than the skills that you need to govern. And this was something that she had said like 3 or 4 years ago. And I think you're seeing that in play right now, is that what's going to get someone elected is someone taking a really strong, harsh stance that's a really clear narrative about what needs to happen. But to actually accomplish things, you can't have that strong of a stance. And I just wonder, like, if there's ever hope for, it would be lovely if the narrative that actually gets somebody elected at some point in the future is healing. It just reminds me of a Jon Stewart show that I saw probably, 7 years ago, where he realized that, going out with a campaign slogan of "be reasonable" was not going to be successful. So I don't know what the answer is.
You know, it made me think of those stories we used to hear about our politicians like Tip O'Neill, who would go out with his Republican colleagues for dinner in the evening and have cocktails and all that. It reminds me of that famous story, and this may have come up on a previous after show about a month ago, about the weird unofficial Christmas Day truce in, was it World War I, where the troops who were closest to each other in the trenches, they just decided, look, let's sing Christmas carols together and let's not shoot at each other anymore. But the generals who were far away from the actualities of the engagement, they were issuing all kinds of brutal commands, you know. So it's almost like proximity or engagement with people, you know, liberals sitting down with conservatives and actually talking and getting to know each other as people, which seems like an impossible prescription right now. Yeah. But it seems like that has to happen, because the people who seem the most entrenched in hating liberals, for example, are the people who, so far as I can see, don't really know any liberals, and vice versa.
I think you might basically be confusing the story with a Coke commercial, with Coke and Pepsi, but
yeah, that often happens in my brain.
No, I mean they did make an ad based on that, but yeah, I mean it was and remember, by the way, speaking of which, the movie, one of my favorite movies of all time. In South Africa, they called it Escape to Victory. Here, they just called it Victory. Have you seen it, Tom?
No, I haven't seen that.
Sylvester Stallone, Michael Caine, basically a bunch of international prisoners of war in a German camp.
I can't believe I've missed a Sylvester Stallone movie as a philosopher. I thought that's like required. Right?
You would love this is deep, man.
Hey, the Coke commercial story about the truce was actually in that new book, Humankind, that I was recommending in a previous after show by the Ruger, the guy, the Dutch writer who's done such an amazing look at human kindness. And Tamsen, if you haven't seen that book, you would love it. It's called Humankind, as in one word.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah.
Rutger Bregman, I think is his name. And it's a wonderful historical look on the real goodness behind all this positioning and posturing and all these aggressive stances people take, the real kindness that's to be found in the majority of human beings.
All right. So escape to victory. I'm going to show you. Tamsen, have you got time for two more minutes?
Yeah, 100%. Yes.
All right, let's see if this actually if this works. So I would have to share. This worked so much better in theory. Okay, here it is. This is for you.
Being stuck at home in the city is no day at the beach. That's what a for. Like a private vacation home at the shore.
You can skip
You don't have to go.
I know.
How long will it take? Well, you must realize it's my busy time. Everybody wants to escape in the good weather.
In 1942, the Nazis thought they were sitting on top of the world, never suspecting that they could be toppled in one conflict, the most unusual battle of the war.
It has been decided that a German national team will play a combined team from the prisoners of war of the occupied territories.
That's crazy.
Okay, I'm ready to sign up.
Sign up,
And you ought to be exhibited in Paris like performing fleas. What about me?
Get out.
A stacked game. The Third Reich's finest against a ragged bunch of prisoners of war. The Germans thought they had it made.
They couldn't run about for 90 minutes. They'd be chucking their guts up.
Am I good? Or am I good?
What's your name?
You know my name.
What's your name?
I decided to join the team.
The American? No.
You use that bloody American style again here and you'll be barred.
Look, you're playing English, I play American.
Can you do with your mouth shut?
Hey, the mouth and the hands work together. It's a team.
This match is a propaganda stunt for the Germans. It's a wonderful opportunity for us.
The Allied High Command called them crazy, and maybe they were.
We want you to contact the resistance for us and arrange the escape of the football team.
But I want to thank you all for your concern, but I'm really not planning on seeing Paris until after the war.
Well, I'm an orphan. I have no parents, no money. I'm not married. I don't even have a pet. And anything I might say in my sleep to the contrary can't be held against me.
We don't wish us to spy, do we?
No. I don't want to be shot as anything.
Victory, starring Sylvester Stallone, Michael Caine, Max von Sydow, and introducing Pele.
How'd you like to play football against the Germans?
Why not?
Is the time for heroes. Victory. You've never seen anything like it.
That's spectacular.
I can't believe how dated it is.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you a quick story. I was 10 years old. It was 1981, and South Africa is still in the throes of apartheid, and I knew Pele was in this, and then there were a couple of other stars that you wouldn't know, but like Ozzy Ordilas, who played for Tottenham Hotspur, which was my team, and John Walk, who played for Ipswich, and all of these players, and we went to school, and then we came back on a school bus. We jumped off the school bus in the middle of our city center, which we shouldn't have done, but we did. And then we went to see this movie, myself and 3 friends. I sat there with a Polaroid camera and a flashlight because we didn't have a flash, and just to try and get photos of these players, because it was Pele and Ordiles and Bobby Moore was in it, and of course none of them came out. But it really takes me back to 10 years old and just seeing this movie and seeing my heroes, etc. It looks so dated, but anyway, that's Victory. I'm sure you won't watch it, Tom. But
I gotta put away my book of dead philosophers and go get my Sylvester Stallone movies. So
excellent.
Oh,
you got it.
All right, what a pleasure to meet you all. Thank you so much.
It's a lot of fun. Thanks for spending it. We don't usually drag guests through this many minutes, but you were fun.
That was a great conversation. I'm happy to.
Tamsen, you are the reason why the after show exists, in terms of a guest that that continues to teach and inspire and add to the conversation and create new ones. So this was, and I say that with full full acknowledgement to my previous guest, who now is part of my family, which is Tom Morris. And so it's been pretty exciting to have you here, and also to put the 2 philosophers together, because everyone's a philosopher. I mean, you are.
That's true.
But come back anytime. You're very welcome.
Please, I would love to. Thanks.
All right, I will stop the recording, and I'll send you an email a little bit later as well with all the links and all that sort of stuff.